that this presentation is being recorded. Thanks for calling in and joining. Can everybody see the slides okay? It should say CSP Enhancements 512 Forage and Biomass Planting.
Yes.
Okay, good. Everything seems to be working. So
Participant has joined the conference. Participant has joined the conference.
All right, we got a few joining just now. In case you missed the first little webinar we did on CSP enhancements, on the prescribed grazing enhancements, I'll just mention real quick that the way that we're organizing these enhancement trainings is by practice, by conservation practice, and the way the reason we're doing it that way is because with the new CSP, every single enhancement is tied back to a conservation practice. And furthermore, in the new CSP, in order to have completed an enhancement, you have to have completed and met the standard for that conservation practice. So every enhancement truly is an enhancement in the true sense, going above and beyond what's required in the basic conservation practice standard. This set of enhancements that we're going to go over today are all of the enhancements that are attached to practice 512, forage and biomass planting, or what I guess us old timers now used to call pasture planting. Here's the list of enhancements that are tied to forage and biomass planting. There's quite a few there. I don't know, like 20. And so as we go through these, I've grouped them to keep from repeating myself very often. My goal is to not repeat myself at all through these. Much of the criteria and documentation requirements and even the enhancement descriptions are precisely word for word the same between a lot of these enhancements. So I've grouped them up here for purposes of presenting them today with enhancements that have the same description and criteria and documentation requirements. Before I get into the groups, we're going to get some things out of the way because there were some criteria in these enhancements that are common to all of the enhancements that are attached to 512. So to keep from repeating myself, I'm going to just cover those enhancements now. Not those enhancements, those criteria now. So the first criteria that is in every one of these enhancements is that recommendations for planting rates, methods, depths, and dates from land grant or research institutions, plant materials programs, extension agencies, or agency field trials will be followed. Seeding medium that does not restrict plant emergence will be provided. You know, a lot of these criteria that's common to all are things that are already in the standard for 512. Like, I guess for emphasis, they wanted to repeat some things here, like noxious species will not be planted, and that plant nutrients and soil amendments for establishment purposes will be applied according to a current soil test. So remember, the land use that we're going to be applying almost all of these on is pasture land, and it's for the enhancement purposes. All of them have this criteria that says you're going to do a soil test, and if it needs nutrients, you're going to apply them at the time that you seed. Also, legume seed will be pre-inoculated with the right rhizobia immediately before planting. Okay, so let's see if this is okay. Those 4 criteria are common to all. Here's the first group of enhancements in 512. These 4. If you remember old CSP enhancements, these are the old ANM03 and ANM41, which were to incorporate native grasses or legumes into 15% or more of the dry matter, and multi-species native perennials for biomass and wildlife habitat. Those 2 old enhancements have been changed into these 4 new enhancements. As you'll notice right there in the title, it says native grasses or legumes. So that is a constraint on these 4 enhancements, is that you have to use native grasses or legumes, and they are incorporating native grasses or legumes for different purposes: for plant productivity and health, for plant structure and composition of the community, for wildlife habitat food, or for livestock production. The land uses that these are applicable on vary quite a bit, depending on which one you choose and for which purpose. You can see some of them even apply to cropland. Some of them, all of them apply to pasture land. The third one there for wildlife applies only to pasture land, but there is this land use of associated ag land that you guys already heard about that land use in the CSP trainings that we had in person. The payment rates for these enhancements are there in the far column, and they range from $21 to $58, and I can't see the last one, but I hope you can. So again, I'll repeat a little bit of what you might already know about associated ag lands as a land use. You've got your rangeland, you got your forest land, you got your cropland, you got your pasture land, and then you've got your associated ag lands. Associated ag lands are land that's associated with farms and ranches, but they're not purposefully managed for food, forage, or fiber. So think odd areas. But they are typically associated with and nearby production and or conservation lands. This could include incidental areas such as idle pivot corners, odd areas, ditches, watercourses, riparian areas, field edges, seasonal and permanent wetlands, and other similar areas are all part of this associated ag lands land use. So when you see the enhancements that are tied to this associated ag lands, that's what you should be thinking about. And a lot of these 512 enhancements do. Okay, so for this set of incorporating native grasses or legumes in the forage base, the enhancement description is to establish adapted and or compatible species, varieties, or cultivars of perennial herbaceous species that can provide the structure and composition needed to enhance livestock and wildlife habitat, etc., etc. The criteria say that you must select native, perennial, grass, forb, and legume plant species, and their cultivars, based on all the things that you would normally look at. But at the same time, plants will be selected that help meet livestock forage demand during times that normal farm and ranch forage production is inadequate. So let me just stop right there. Picture a pasture land, typically irrigated. What native species are we going to be able to choose, because we're constrained to native species, that will fill this need and criteria here? Plants that will be selected to meet livestock forage demand during times when normal production is inadequate. Can anybody think of an example?
Non-irrigated pasture, or I guess just pasture in general.
No, it's supposed to be for pasture lands, which is almost always irrigated in Utah. This is a tough one, and so these, I think this set of enhancements is going to be tough for us to use with the native constraint. So, yeah, in Utah, here's the only idea I could come up with. Maybe you have a riparian area that's adjacent to pasture or cropland, or you have pivot corners, associated ag lands, and you want to do winter stockpile grazing, then you can put in Great Basin wild rye. Great Basin wild rye could be used effectively for winter stockpile grazing. And in fact, if you chose to do this, this could fit in with some other enhancements that we already talked about in 528 for the winter stockpile grazing, I think. And the only other idea is, it's kind of a dumb idea. Mountain brome is a native grass. It's the only one I could think of that might do okay in an irrigated pasture. But we do have one legume that's made for irrigated pastures that is native, and that is Utah sweet vetch. But that's just one plant. So anyway, like I say, this little set's going to be hard to apply. The next set is for pollinator or beneficial insect habitat. Renee, are you on?
Yeah, I'm on.
Okay. Did you want to talk about these, or?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take these. So you can see that the old code for this was PLT 15, and now it's going from one enhancement is now broken down into 3 different enhancements, where the payment is pretty similar. The first one is addressing pollinator and beneficial insect habitat. And then the next one is dealing with similar pollinator insect habitat continuity, so it's talking about space, whereas the first one deals a little bit more with food. And then the third one is dealing with space as well, but more specific to monarch butterflies. The first one is can only be done on pasture, whereas the last 2 dealing with space can be done on pasture, associated ag land, and farmstead. Okay. So with this, the enhancement description is saying that establishing adapted or compatible species, varieties, or cultivars of herbaceous species that can provide nectar, food for pollinators, and forage and other habitat values for wildlife and livestock, particularly at times when those resources might not be otherwise available in other pastures. Okay, you can forward it. So the criteria then for establishing establishing pollinator or monarch butterfly habitat is selecting native, perennial, grass-forb legume plant species and their cultivars, similar language that we saw in the other criteria, considering everything that you usually consider, but relative now specifically to pollinators and monarch butterflies, providing them for, and then where it overlaps with habitat values for livestock as well. Okay, next slide. Additional criteria are those plants will be selected to help meet those nectar requirements for monarch butterflies or other pollinators during the times where they would be in Utah, which ends up being a large part of the growing season, and that those will specifically be used when looking at the monarch butterfly wag or other pollinator wags. Okay, next slide. And then one bit of criteria that's specific only to monarch habitat work in pastures is that the enhancement is acceptable for use when converting from cropland or degraded pastureland sites that require forage and biomass planting in order to stabilize the site to address the resource concern. And in Utah, these enhancements might include maybe basic pollinator planting, and in those odd areas like those pivot corners, riparian ditch banks, etc. Or the other idea that Shane came up with is maybe incorporating Utah sweet vetch into pasture planting and planning to allow it to bloom prior to grazing. Documentation that's required for these enhancements are the state-approved WAG for the pollinator or monarch, certified by an NRCS or partner wildlife biologist, and that ends up being at the after implementation score needs to be equal to or greater than 0.75. There needs to be documentation of the seed and any fertilizer or amendments that are purchased for that enhancement, and there needs to be a Forage balance sheet completed for the farm or ranch and the grazing records. Okay, next slide.
When are we going to see these WAGs?
There is, I understand that there is a WAG actually for monarchs that have come out from the Zerk Society, and that's something that's common across the board. As far as the general pollinators, I'm going to have to get back to you guys on that, because I'm not sure exactly what's in place right now.
Okay, thanks, Renee. We'll just pause here for a minute. Is there any other questions? Since we're using Skype, you can type questions into the chat, or you can just blurt your question out over the phone. We'll try to get to it. There's 5 enhancements in this next group. All of these are replacing the old enhancement of conversion of cropland to grass-based agriculture. And now they're called the same thing, but instead of 1, there are 5. And the difference between the 5 is which resource concern you're addressing. Soil erosion, water, wind, organic matter depletion, water quality, excessive sediment, or plant community productivity and health. These pay between $4 and $36 an acre. They're applicable only to cropland. both perennial cropland like alfalfa stands and annual cropland. So this is basically doing a land use conversion, changing cropland to something that's grass-based. The description is conversion of cropland to grass-based agriculture. Mixes of perennial grasses, forbs, or legume species are established on cropland where annually seeded cash crops have been grown. The criteria, you have to be able to show with the NRCS wind and water erosion prediction technologies that there's going to be a soil erosion estimate that's before and after. In wind erosion, in or water erosion, or the soil conditioning index, or a sediment reduction. And those are for those 4 applicable enhancements. Another criteria is you have to establish perennial grassland mixture on cropland. Mixes shall be selected based on having at least 50% grass species. And the rest of this stuff that's here is things that we always look at when we do a seeding anyway. Make sure that it's in the right hardiness zone, in the right temperature regime, in the right pH, in the right water holding capacity, in the right everything. But the real constraint here is you have to have at least 50% grass species. So somebody with an alfalfa stand could reseed it to 50% grass, 50% alfalfa, and I think qualify for this enhancement. They must, all the seed and planting materials must meet the state's quality standards. Exclude livestock until they're established. Ground cover and root mass need to be sufficient to protect the soil from wind and water erosion. A grazing plan must be developed if it's going to be grazed, and not more than 20% of the mixture may be alfalfa. Other legumes may be used in place of or in addition to alfalfa, up to a maximum legume percentage of 50%. To document this, you need to show the results of those erosion prediction and soil condition or whatever technologies that you used. You need to show the plans. Basically, if we use the 512 spec sheet that we have in Utah, it's going to have all of this documentation on it. But then if it's going to be used as hayland, you need a harvest plan. And if it's going to be grazed, you need a grazing plan as well. My slides seem to be stuck. So in Utah, these enhancements could include any cropland, annual or perennial, so including hayland, that's converted to a mix of perennials with at least 50% grasses and not more than 20% alfalfa. Grazing is not necessary, so you could use these for hay once you've established them. Any question on that set? All right, the next set are 4 enhancements that were attached to an old enhancement, SQL 16, that was called High Species Diversity Grazing Lands. These new enhancements are called Forage and Biomass Plantings for something. You can do one for soil erosion, organic matter depletion, inadequate structure and composition, or wildlife habitat. These are all applicable on pasture lands. They pay between, looks like, $13 and $75 an acre. So for the one that's enhancing the bird habitat, the enhancement description is establishing adapted and or compatible species, varieties, or cultivars that can provide cover and shelter components of bird habitat, or that can provide does that say the same thing? Oh, structure and composition and cover and shelter are the two differences there. Yeah, that's the last two enhancements on this list here. So the criteria. You have to choose a wildlife species of concern. And you have to do a state WEG for these. Maybe I am speaking out of turn here now. Renee, do you think it'd be adequate for people to use the do we have a general WEG for cropland or pasture land?
I think we do.
Okay. So anyway.
Yeah, we do. We have a crop, pasture, hayland, WEG, and then so that one would.
So that's a general WEG, but even though you're doing a general WEG, you still have to choose a species of concern, it looks like. So what species or group of species were you thinking about when you did this WEG? Because you're going to have to end up with an after installation score of 0.75. It turns out that this set of enhancements also has the constraint of native plants again, just like the first set that we looked at. And plants will be selected that help meet cover and shelter for the bird species at times that normal forage production is inadequate. To document these, you have to show the WEG, you have to show the after implementation score of 0.75, you have to show all your documentation for the seed that you planted, just like you do anytime you do a pasture planting. And if it's grazed, and it will be since this is on pasture land, you need to show your grazing plan. So again, in Utah, these enhancements might include on the associated ag lands using Great Basin wildlife for winter stockpile grazing. I think the hardest thing in applying any of these enhancements is that constraint that's in them to have to use native plants, which is just a hard thing to do on pastures in Utah. So if we do it with the first two that were for soil instead of for the bird habitat, you have to show the erosion prediction tools that is going to show the difference in before and after, or organic matter difference before and after the enhancement. And so here the native constraint wasn't a piece of it. They're saying you need to select plants that will provide ground cover and root mass sufficient to protect the soil from wind or water. it's saying that this enhancement is applicable where soils have been depleted of organic matter, typically from direct exposure to air through plowing or disking, and or having little or no vegetation growing on the soil for a period of time. So if there's a pasture or a part of a pasture, because remember these were applicable on pasture lands, that has been particularly abused over a period of time that has resulted in a depletion of soil organic matter, this is your enhancement to fix that. It's a pretty specific set of circumstances. And so the documentation requirements, again, here's basic stuff that you do when you do this practice anyway. With the addition of, we want the pasture condition scoring records every year on the sites that get planted. So in Utah, this might include establishing a pasture or reestablishing a pasture in a very degraded pasture. The last two enhancements attached to 512 are ones that don't have an old enhancement to crosswalk to. These are just brand new. And they are to establish wildlife corridors to enhance access to water or habitat continuity. Okay, Renee, why don't you take these last two wildlife ones?
Okay. So these, so these are dealing with wildlife corridors to either access water or for habitat continuity. And these can be applied on pasture lands, associated ag, or farmsteads, with a payment rate of roughly around 25 for each of them. Pretty similar. The enhancement description for these wildlife corridors is establishing adapted and or compatible species, varieties or cultivars of perennial herbaceous species that might provide cover needed for wildlife species, either to move to food cover water resources or have rely on food cover water resources for their life cycles, or of course to provide habitat for them to move, especially where you have underused wildlife habitat areas. The criteria are to select similar language that we've seen in a lot of these, select a native, perennial, grass, shrub, legume, plant species, and their cultivars. Basically, to meet the cover demand for movement by the wildlife species of concern. Plant selection should be made and maintained based on the state-approved NRCS habitat evaluation procedure. Protection from grazing or other plant defoliation and biomass loss will be provided as needed to assure adequate corridor cover during the primary wildlife movement timeframe. And wildlife species of concern for corridor utilization will be specified on the state-approved NRCS WAG. The documentation requirements for these wildlife corridors are NRCS state-approved WAG, completed and certified by NRCS or a partner wildlife biologist, where the total WAG after installation is equal to or greater than 0.75, and documentation of seed and any fertilizer amendments that are purchased. And in Utah, these enhancements might include connecting wildlife habitat areas, between maybe rangelands and forests, riparian areas or wetlands, with corridors through these pastures or associated ag lands or farmsteads. Grazing plans could include deferral for winter stockpile grazing.
Okay, I think this is my last slide here for 512. I just wanted to Mention again that people want to know what are the state supplements to these enhancements. And we want to convey to you that, that there's basically one blanket state supplement so far for all of the enhancements, and that is that we want you to use the practice standard, the state practice standard, with the documentation requirements that are listed in the state practice standard have to be covered, as well as the documentation requirements that are listed in each enhancement. Very often they'll be the same. Sometimes there might be one or two that are a little different. Also, for each of the practices or each of the enhancements, we would like you to use the spec sheet to both plan and certify the enhancement being done, because you have to meet the basic practice first and the enhancement is on top of it. We can use our spec sheets effectively to fulfill a lot of the documentation requirements that are already listed and required in each of these enhancements. So as far as paperwork, that's the forms that we want you to use for these enhancements. Any questions on that? Okay, moving on. We've been on for 40 minutes. That means we're on track. And I'm just going to pull a little switch here to the other PowerPoint on the range planting and the tree and shrub establishment practices. Can everyone still see the slides?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, good. All right, this next set, there's about half an hour to go here. It's for the enhancements that are tied to both range planting and tree and shrub establishment. So here's the list of those. You can see there's only 2 enhancements that are tied to range planting. And it looks like, 9 or 10 that are tied to tree and shrub planting. So the first 2, the range planting ones, are both in a group. They tie to an old enhancement that was called prairie restoration. And so the old prairie restoration enhancement is now range planting for increasing and maintaining organic matter, or range planting for improving forage, browse, or cover for wildlife. And so it looks like the organic matter depletion one pays $41 an acre. The wildlife habitat one pays $97 an acre. They're only applicable on rangeland, and they're definitely applicable in Utah now that it's not just prairie restoration. So they've broadened them out some. The enhancement description, each one of them is different. Actually, the one that is for wildlife, oh, here I go mowing your grass again, Renee. But
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, the one for wildlife, the enhancement description is to establish adapted perennial or self-sustaining vegetation, such as grass, forests, legumes, shrubs, or trees, for the purpose of improving forage, browse, or cover for wildlife on areas that have already been degraded beyond recovery. Or old crop fields and pastures devoid of desirable native rangeland species that fit within the ESD of a steady state.
Okay. And so if we're going to do this for increasing or maintaining organic matter and choose that particular enhancements, this again, it says for areas that have been degraded beyond recovery via ecological principles. Basically what that means to me is if you can't improve this plant community just with grazing management, and you have to step in and plant something to assist, that is the circumstances that these enhancements would apply to. Talks about old crop fields and pastures, although it also said that this was only applicable to rangelands. So I guess if they were crop fields or pastures long ago, we're talking about severely degraded systems here. Okay, so they might have those differing enhancement descriptions, but they had the same criteria. The criteria are, we're going to use the Plant Materials Center or research or agency demonstration trial information to help choose what gets planted, and we're going to use the ecological site description to choose one of the states in the state and transition model that we are trying to achieve. And there's things in here about seedbed prep and planting depths and basic things about the range planting practice that we always do. So again, specifically for wildlife now, there were some particular things about pollinators and birds and monarch butterflies that you'd have to consider when choosing species. And you'd have to be able to document that whatever you're doing is going to help meet some life history requirements for the species of concern. Now specifically for organic matter, soil organic matter depletion, whatever we do has to increase the productive plant biomass on the site. And this was an interesting worded criteria. Maybe you can help me decide what this means. It says reduce the temporal frequency of carbon release caused by non-historical repetition of fire. Does that mean if it burns too often,
Yeah, you're getting too much carbon release.
then too much carbon releases? So whatever we plant should reduce
The fire interval.
the fire interval.
Yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, that's what that means. Documentation requirements are pretty basic. Besides just what you need for a range planting, they're looking for a site description and or reference sheet that and you're going to point to which plant community phase that you were shooting for in doing this seeding. Documentation provided that defines the planned plant community. That's what that means. So you're going to do a site-specific job sheet. This is why we want you to use the spec sheets that we have for these practices. And go back. Range planting. That's all I had on these range planting practices. I don't think they're going to be that common. They have to be very specific for purposes of wildlife habitat or soil organic matter depletion. So being able to document those as resource concerns at the outset, with their examples of, look, this is for old crop fields and places where the plant community is so gone that you have to do a seeding. That's something you're going to have your eye on when you're considering using these enhancements. Okay, moving on to the enhancements for 612. 612 is tree and shrub establishment. And there were some criteria in all of the enhancements for tree and shrub establishment that were the same, and we'll just go over those now. No trees on the noxious weeds list can be planted. The planting or seeding rates will be adequate. Only viable high-quality planting stock will be used. Planting dates, care and handling of all the plant materials must be done so that there's an acceptable rate of survival for the intended purpose. A precondition of tree and shrub establishment is appropriately prepared sites. And we have a whole practice for tree and shrub site preparation that goes into things like reducing the weed competition and everything you have to do to prepare a site to plant a tree or a shrub. That cannot be ignored when choosing these 612 enhancements. More common criteria. The technique of planting and the timing will be appropriate for the site and soil. Refer to integrated pest management for site-specific strategies for pest prevention, avoidance, pest monitoring, pest suppression. Protect your plantings from competition from invasive plants. Each site will be evaluated to determine if mulching, supplemental water, or other treatments will be needed, such as protection devices, shade cards, weed mats, to ensure adequate survival and growth. What they're getting at here is they don't want people to just be able to plant trees and get paid for it. They want them to seriously make an effort to get trees established and take care of any situation that might prevent that, to use these enhancements. And honestly, all of that is part of the practice standard already. That's why it's common to all of these enhancements. The first set of 612 enhancements, there's 2 612 enhancements in new CSP that replaced 3 enhancements in old CSP. The old enhancements were multi-story cropping, renovation of a windbreak or shelter belt, and increasing on-farm food production with edible woody buffer landscapes. The new enhancements are cultural plantings and adding food-producing trees and shrubs to existing plantings. Now, these are both trying to get at degraded plant condition, inadequate structure and composition, resource concerns. They're applicable on any, I think, every land use. Is there any land use there that's not listed? I don't think so. Planting trees is good for everybody, everywhere. And the payments for these enhancements are about a little over $1,300 an acre. But here's what's interesting. On the payment schedule, in fact, all the payments that we've been telling you in that column in these webinars so far have been per acre payments, except this one for adding food producing trees and shrubs to existing plantings. That was listed as per each instead of per acre. I'm still not certain if that wasn't just a typo
almost have to be. You're not going to pay $1,300 a tree.
Well, it's not a tree. It would be $13 per occurrence of this
Oh, just occurrence
of this enhancement.
Yeah, I kind of got it.
But so if you get to using this one seriously, we're gonna have to figure out if that's not a typo in the payment schedule or not. Anyway, moving on. The enhancement description. Okay, for the cultural plantings, this is planting trees and shrubs that are of cultural significance, such as those species utilized by tribes in traditional practices, medicinal plants, species used in basket making, etc.
Must be like peyote.
Yeah, peyote maybe. I don't know, but probably not that. But that is the kind of cultural that we're talking about for these cultural plantings. The criteria, if you're going to be doing this under a forest canopy, you have to use the multi-story cropping. Trees and shrubs will be selected for their cultural importance and their adaptability to site conditions. You have to document the cultural uses of the selected tree and shrub species. And I guess they're expecting some usage of not that commonly cultivated plant materials here, because they also want you to do follow-up inspections to expand the knowledge of site requirements and management practices for these less often cultivated species. So I bet we use this one a lot. But here's the one that I read and I thought, wow, planting apple trees. That might be popular. I don't know. The enhancement description here is plant food producing trees and shrubs for wildlife or human consumption. Well, here's the trick. Within windbreaks, alley cropping, multi-story cropping, silvopasture systems, and or riparian forest buffers, you have to have an existing agroforestry planting that you're going to incorporate food producing trees into. You can't just plant apple trees.
You're not gonna use this to plant your orchard, I guess.
Yeah, they don't want you to just plant your orchard with this. So the criteria is to apply one of the following activities within existing windbreaks, alley cropping, all those things. You need to add at least one edible food producing row to an existing linear planting. You need to add clusters of food producing plants in existing plantings so that they occupy at least 10% of the total area of the established agroforestry practice. And you need to, you need to add food producing plants to occupy idle areas of the operation, such as field corners adjacent to existing plantings. So there's a lot of ways to incorporate food producing trees in an existing planting. The trick here is you need to have some kind of existing agroforestry to do this. And maybe that's why they did it each instead of per acre. I don't know. This is the one that was listed as per each in the payment schedule. The criteria, you need to plant a variety, 3 or more different species, using native species whenever possible. And the trees and shrubs will be planted on selected areas within any land use that contains an agroforestry installation. So again, emphasis on this is to add to something that's there already agroforestry wise. Maximize the planting space by creating vertical structure, minimize herbicide use, and there's going to be a state list of suitable woody plants for food producing species that I don't think we have as of yet. So can I just take a poll of those of you that are listening? Is there any interest at all in pursuing this enhancement? Okay, you're
I have to try it. I think that'll be up to our customers. There may be some that have some woody plantings that they would plant into. The reason this is adding food producing trees is because all these enhancements are based on exceeding an existing practice. So you'll see that quite a bit is we're going to add to an existing practice, not build a practice. You can do that, but the payment rate's pretty low.
okay. Thank you, Travis. Thanks for chiming in. And I guess we can probably handle, what's on the state list as if and when this comes up. We'll work with you. The documentation requirements for this are pretty basic as far as tree and shrub planting goes, but the one additional thing I could see was you need to document the suitability of the selected food producing plants for the site. Okay, I think this might be the last two. Well, no, it's not, but it's two that have to do with wildlife. So you want to do these, Renee?
Okay, so these are two enhancements where there is no old corresponding enhancement. They're tree shrub planting for wildlife cover and for food. And these look like they can be applied pretty much on all land types. And the payment is around $1,400 per acre. The description for these enhancements are tree shrub plantings that'll enhance habitat for native wildlife. Specifically, a minimum of 5 tree and shrub species will be used, and they will be species that provide food or cover for identified wildlife species. The criteria for the tree or shrub plantings for food or cover for wildlife are that the trees and shrubs would be selected based on their importance for providing cover for specific wildlife and their adaptability to specific site conditions. And it says to refer to state list. Second, to select a minimum of 5 species of trees and shrubs with at least 1 tree species and 1 shrub species. Well, that's interesting. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Not a lot of this
to
does.
me. But then it says in parentheses, for example, 1 tree and I see. So a minimum of 5 of a mix of tree and shrubs. Okay. And then the third criteria, trees and shrubs will be planted on selected areas within any land use, and grouping the trees and shrubs will be designed for best growth, visual appeal, and proximity to areas of wildlife use and other locations, depending on the landowner objectives. And then the last one, trees and shrubs would be planted in areas with adequate sunlight. And if the plantings are used in forested settings, planting canopy openings, I can't see us really needing to rely on that specific criteria in Utah very much. And then those plantings will follow whatever the rest of that bullet said. Will follow the state's CPS tree and shrub establishment under 612. Okay, for documentation requirements for these tree and shrub wildlife food and cover plantings. plans and the specifications for applying this practice will be prepared for each site and recorded using approved specification sheet, implementation requirements, technical notes, and narrative statements in the conservation plan or other acceptable documentation, and then document the wildlife cover benefits of those tree shrub cover species that are chosen, including a map of the location where the plantings will be.
Okay. Now I think we're on the home stretch, if I remember right. Anyway, I'm on slide 25 of 33, and we have been going for an hour, but hang in there. We're going to finish this. The next set are 3 that have no old enhancements that tie back to. These are all for conversion of cropland to trees or shrubs. So just like we had the practice before in 512 about you could take cropland and convert it to grass-based agriculture, here's 3 enhancements where you can take cropland and convert it to trees and shrubs. And you do it for 3 different purposes: wind erosion, water erosion, or water quality. These enhancements all pay $755 an acre and are only applicable to cropland, either annual or perennial. The enhancement description of these 3 is cropland conversion to trees and shrubs for long-term erosion control and improvement of water quality. Trees and shrubs are established on cropland where annually seeded cash crops have been grown. The criteria of these enhancements is that the composition of species will be adapted to site conditions and suitable for the planned purpose of providing long-term soil erosion control. Planting rates will be adequate for the soil erosion control. You need to evaluate residual chemical carryover prior to planting and alter the species selection and or timing of planting and seeding to achieve adequate seed germination or seedling establishment. That one stuck in there because they're realizing that this is former cropland. So we have to be cognizant of any chemical carryovers that might affect trying to do this. The documentation requirements are basic for 612, including the wildlife benefits of the species that are chosen. I don't think, I mean, I can envision this happening in Utah, but I can't think of a specific example of how this might occur. It's an option, I guess.
Yeah, if you had somebody with kind of marginal cropland that wanted to plant it back into kind of like shrub step type of stuff, I guess you could.
Yeah. And let's see, there is, I think 2 more enhancements. This one is tree and shrub planting for carbon sequestration. It's done for air quality purposes. It is applicable on any land use, and it pays $978 an acre. And Travis Motor, you still on? Unmute your phone. I have to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Okay. Chet's here with me, and he was asking, we're seeing this huge range in these payments that we've seen from $1 and change to $1,300 an acre for the various enhancements that we've covered in these webinars, and was wondering, are these annual payments or one-time payments, or does it vary?
I think it depends on how the enhancement, like I said, the management practice, it'll be paid each year, and then enhancements like this will be a single time payment we'll certify it, and then that year, in October or thereafter, we will make that payment.
Okay, that makes sense to me. Good.
And dang it, Shane was gonna plant his whole pasture to some of this stuff and get $1,000 an acre a year.
Yeah, oh heck yeah. Apple trees, all apple trees. Okay. Carbon sequestration. Back on track here. The enhancement description. Plant tree species and use stocking levels for higher growth to increase the rate of carbon sequestration. So we want fast growing trees on any land use. So hybrid poplars for everybody. And we want species with a longer lifespan. Oh crap, they have to live a long time too. Yeah, we want something that grows fast and lives long.
Rush olive trees.
Oh yeah, okay. Probably not.
Hey, Shane, just to add to that payment comment I made, it depends on the lifespan. So if the lifespan's 1 year, that'll be an active payment. If the lifespan's longer than that, like the tree and shrub establishment probably has lifespan of 25 years. So that'd be a single payment.
Okay, so we look at the lifespans to determine how those payments are. Okay, that makes sense. Thanks, Travis. Yeah. Okay, back to the carbon sequestering trees. So we're either gonna take trees and plant them where there aren't any trees, or we're gonna take a forest that is not fully stocked and add more trees. And this had a vocabulary word in it for me, that afforestation. Who knows what afforestation is?
Probably the opposite of deforestation.
Not quite the opposite of deforestation. It's related. So deforestation is removing trees, and so there's two words for adding trees: reforestation or afforestation.
Okay, and afforestation is more of an increase in the number of trees?
Afforestation is planting trees on lands that were not formerly forests.
Oh, okay, there you go.
Reforestation is planting trees where there were forest lands. Okay, enough of that. Sorry, I know that's why you're not here. Not why you're here. But the criteria for the carbon sequestration enhancement, trees will be selected for their rate of growth and suitability for use in durable manufactured products, as well as their adaptability to site conditions. They want you to be able to utilize these trees, take the carbon, sequester it, and then use that wood as a manufactured product. I suppose that helps ensure the carbon remains sequestered. They can be on any land use and someplace with adequate sunlight, and follow the standard for 612, of course. Documentation requirements, beyond the normal 612 requirements, they wanted to document why you selected the species you did with reference to the rate of growth and or suitability for use in durable manufactured products, as well as its lack of invasive characteristics. So again, this is the last slide for today and for today's webinar, and it's just emphasizing that, again, in Utah, we want you to use the state standard documentation requirements and the state spec sheets for these practices to plan and document them. With that, are there any questions, comments?
Hey, Shane, this is Travis. I have one more comment.
Good.
We've been going through these enhancements. There's quite a few of the wildlife ones that require a 0.75 leg. I think it would behoove us as a state to look at that as we start implementing these, because the newest legs that we have kind of been revised to more of a area-wide or landscape planning level, and sometimes small farms are not able to fit well to get that high of a leg score from what I've seen in my experience. And so if going forward, we can't use those as our WAG is looking at landscape scope instead of a narrow scope, it might be worth looking into that in years to come.
Good comment. Did you catch that, Renee?
Yeah, I did. Yep, wrote it all down. Thank you, Travis.
Okay. Well, I don't know what it's like where you're at, but it's like hail or freezing rain or something like it outside where I am. So, looking forward to getting home somehow today. Thanks for joining again. Any other questions or comments before we close? Okay, we're going to try to pull off some more of these next week, the week before Christmas. I'll send out some announcements this afternoon, I hope, for
Participants have left the conference.
Maybe Tuesday or Wednesday next week. So, thanks again. Goodbye.
Hi.
And that'll just do them all since I was leader. So, okay.
Very cool.